All right. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another session of Herodotus in the Sunoikesis class. So I am going to talk a little bit about book 4 with you tonight, and then our good friend, Professor Fowler, will also be joining us and talking a little bit about book 4 as well. So remember that this is all about the Persian wars with Greece fighting with Persia, right? And repelling the invasion of Persia. And we haven't even got to that yet. We are on book 4 and we're still getting background information. And so we meet yet another group of people, and I'm going to share some of the slides that me and Professor Fowler put together on my screen. There's also a PDF document of these slides. So let's see, let me start my little slideshow. So we meet a new group of people. Now we've sort of moved over to the north with the Scythians, or Scythians, however you want to say it. In Greek, it would be a kappa, so a hard K, but sometimes that gets softened. So Herodotus does his usual ethnography, his analysis of this culture, and something we've talked a little bit about is Herodotus's interest in causality, and he's interested in the causes, a lot of times personal motivations that lead people to act, as we discussed especially in book 1. But he's also looking at historical and cultural causes for conflict, and also reasons why people do customs that they do. So in the interest of explaining a little bit about the Scythians, he has to tell some stories. The Scythians were known to be good archers. Archery was their thing. This is a Greek vase painting that we have that shows their gear, their warrior headdress and outfits. So their interest in archery is one thing he wants to talk about. I notice he tells a couple little stories, one of which involves Hercules, who was also a good archer. The Scythians were also known for gold in the ancient world. So that is another thing that Herodotus wants to explain or give a cause for. And so there are a couple little stories there. So Herodotus's interest in causality is not surprising, and we see it reflected here. Remember, the whole thing is about the causes of the conflicts between the Greeks and the Persians. We just haven't got there yet because there are so many interesting causes that Herodotus gets sidetracked by sometimes, or he just wants to give the full picture rather. And so we also are on the cusp of understanding, or on the cusp of getting to the actual Greek and Persian conflict. And taking a look at this map, I like this map because I think it helps understand a little bit about some of these digressions, both geographically and chronologically. This map shows what the Persians, and in particular Darius, are doing to expand their empire. And so, especially with the red, we saw in we saw in book 2, we talked about Egypt, and then in book 3, we see the red over to the east with the Darius's expansion into India, and in book 3, then we got to hear about the Indians, and now we come back west a little bit, and now we're up on that northern edge of Greece, modern day Ukraine. And then Darius is going to turn his sights on northern Africa. So then that's the next blob of red across the Mediterranean. So Herodotus is following Darius's campaigns geographically and chronologically, and I just like that map. If for me, it's a visual for how he's telling the story in different ways. So let's see. Notice that the Scythians are a little bit different because they are Europeans. So you should see a slightly different analysis on Herodotus's part. And then he also moves on to the Greek colonists of northern Africa, and they are ethnically Greek, linguistically Greek. So you should watch for how he talks about them, and how see if the people from Cyrene are any different than how he talks about the Egyptians, the Indians, the Scythians. So there is an interesting conversation in the chat room about ways we can distinguish the Scythians from the Egyptians. Jenny points out that the nomadic tendencies, with few smaller cities instead of large cities. Climate, they're not agricultural. They don't have sown land. So these things are great things to start noticing. It's easy to get bogged down in the details, but if you look at those broad strokes and see how he's trying to differentiate these people, notice that, I don't know, something cool about Herodotus, in my opinion, is he wants to highlight differences, but there's also universal themes. He's connecting, showing that the human experience is also kind of universal, even though we have our different customs. Something to think about. So, oh yes, they're young. They're supposed to be the youngest of all nations. So keep thinking about those. All right, we're going to do something a little different. Since sometimes it is easy to, or we almost have to, going at this pace to sort of read quickly and try to get the big picture. Sometimes it's good to go back and read something a little more carefully. So what I'd like us to do is, let's see, let me find my slide again. And there is Professor Fowler joining us. Welcome, Ryan. We were just about to do our close reading of the continents.
Oh, fantastic.
So let me find my slide again. All right. Oh, I pointed out that in the slideshow, there's Cyrene in North Africa. So I want you to, if you have your books, to come to open them up to section 36, pretty early on, where Herodotus takes a minute to compare the relative sizes of the continents, Asia and Europe, and then he calls Africa Libya. He considers what we would call Africa, he calls it by the term Libya. So let's take a minute to read sections 36 to 42. And if you do not have your book, I did put a link to the Perseus. Let me find my the Perseus Project section, translation of that, and I'll put that in the chat room as well. So we're just going to take a few minutes, and what I'd like you to think about is what should we get out of this? Why does he take the time to discuss this? What do you think he's doing there? Okay, what do you guys think is the purpose or the intent of this description of the continents as Herodotus knows? All right. So Helen writes about how he's not afraid to prove people wrong. Okay, so good. That's a big, that's an important item, that he is laying out what people say. And as Professor Good noted in the chat room, Ptolemy and others before him from Herodotus's time thought of the continents as being balanced and equally distributed, and he doesn't agree about that. So there's some implication of his, or indication of his method here, critical thinking, of taking something that people accept as true and explaining why he thinks it might not be so. Other thoughts, and I invite Belmont Abbey or Southwestern, if anyone wants to speak on camera, please join us.
Have you all discussed the idea or the fact that in the Mediterranean Sea actually isn't in the text? He just calls it this sea.
We haven't talked about that specifically.
I mean, well, the fact that Herodotus here at 39 I'm looking at that landmark Herodotus. So I mean, 39:2, and at 41, he calls the Mediterranean simply this sea, referring to the sea closest to himself and his audience, right? He doesn't even need to say the word Mediterranean. I mean, there is a word for it, right? So
Yeah.
For me, that locates his audience, and his history is, as saying this sea, he's locating his history in relation to his audience. I think that really, I don't know, to me that matters.
Yeah, in the Green translation, it's our sea.
Right. Oh, that's even better. Gosh, isn't that nice?
Alex on our, yes.
Oh, okay. So I think the Greek is this sea, but that's,
yeah,
it's a nice indication of sort of grounding the history in a time and place and for an audience.
All right, and let's see some other. It helps us understand where the cultures are. That is a good point. He tries to give us firsthand experience of his cultures, and some of this stuff, some of the geography, he is describing his own firsthand experience. So that gives him a sense of authority too, again, in his effort to say he knows more. He says, I don't think that the continents are equally divided. And let me just tell you, because I know better. I don't know. That's sort of his attitude, right? And Jenny also points out that Greece is the center of all that is good, just like Professor Fowler just said. Okay. Yes, he doesn't seem to know much about Western Europe. Any other thoughts? I think you guys covered a lot. I don't know.
I think there's this idea, although it does not actually end here except by convention. What is Green's translation in 39:1? Is it the Arabian Gulf, though it does not actually end here but by convention? Is that
though it ends only by a kind of convention? Yeah.
Yeah, it's the landmasses are connected, and therefore the continent does not really end. I mean, I think it matters that he's recognizing I think conventional division actually matters there.
Yeah.
The connectivity. In other words, division matters, right? Where something ends and something else begins is extremely important because it's identity, right? I mean,
right.
That's
what all this boundary talk is about.
Yeah, I think so. Boundaries are. You don't know where anything is unless it's boundaried, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, and like we said, he mentions the West is unknown, but he also clearly describes people going beyond the Pillars of Heracles or Gibraltar, just like Professor Haskell noted in the chat room. So I don't know why that's a little confusing for him, but any other thoughts on that? I just thought we'd read something a little closely. And yes, Professor Wadden points out that in that further on in that passage, he talks about some of the Phoenicians circumnavigating Africa, and it takes them 3 years, more than 2 years, to get all the way back to what he calls the Red Sea, we would call, right? Back to Egypt, right? From the other side. and that's just kind of a fascinating tidbit, that you'd think he'd make Libya bigger, Herodotus, if he had realized, or if he had thought about how long 2 years of sailing would be. And historically, that feat was not replicated until like what, the 1400s. So those Phoenicians, they were cutting edge, to say the least. So I did. So some people have attempted to
Have we lost Gwen? Jonathan, are you still on there?
Yeah, she's frozen on my computer, but I can hear you and I can see you moving. Ryan Fowler seems to be frozen as well. Oh dear.
Uh-oh.
Dear.
Same reception here. Oh, now Ryan's moving
All right.
a little bit.
While we're waiting for them, does anyone else want to pitch in with ideas about things that are going on in book 4? I had one thing that I just thought I'd kind of bring up, just out of interest, because we mentioned this bit in, I think, in book 3, when Herodotus is talking about the relationships between the different peoples in Africa, and the Egyptians and the Ethiopians and the other peoples who live around them. And at one point he says that, I don't have the passage in front of me, but he says that one group of people living in somewhere in Africa, they look like Ethiopians, they have the dark skin and the hair, but he says they're not Ethiopians because they don't practice Ethiopian culture. So it seems like culture is more a defining character for him than what we would think of as racial characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
And then in book 4, there's one of the Scythian kings who had a Greek mother, and it's this great bit where he gets his army to march to a Greek city, and he likes to go in and like act Greek for a few weeks at a time as a little vacation, with them guarding him outside because they don't like foreign customs. And then once he's done it for a little while, he then changes his clothes and he goes back to being a Scythian again. And I just think that says something very interesting about cultural identity and the fact that you can cross these borders, regardless of what you look like. If you behave in a certain way, you can cross borders between different identities. And when we think of the world today with all the talk in the news about migrants and things like that, it just struck me as very very relevant. But I see that Gwen is back, so I'll stop talking now.
I think that's I heard some of that. I think that was a really great point, that you can become someone or past, or whatever the case may be. As if, I like how you said, as a vacation, sort of as a visitor, but I wouldn't want to live there. But you take on the dress and you play the part in some ways. And I think that's a really interesting way to put it. Really interesting, because he's so interested in how you sacrifice, how you worship, how you bury, how, what makes you you. And then you can, to have that identity so fluid is rather fascinating at the same time. Your sense is, it sounds like that it's really temporary. You can visit, but you can't maintain it for too long, because it would actually, wouldn't it butt up against your beliefs, your truly held sort of individual core? But to take it on for a bit is a really interesting idea. I like.
And he makes a point of saying that while this Scythian king is in the Greek city, that he sacrifices to the Greek gods. So he goes headfirst into it and makes the transition.
Right. That's very clear in Herodotus, right? That for Homer, this was a civil war because the Trojans and the Greeks worshiped the same. They had the same gods, right? And that's really what it comes down to. And I think, in some sense, doesn't Herodotus take that on as well? If you are acknowledging the gods of that country, then you are, there you have some sort of gesture toward being that. I wonder if it's a holdover from identity as religion in some ways. It's really, really interesting. It's neat. Quiz back.
I am. Sorry, and I hope, since I am in charge of this, I hope that we didn't lose on the recording what you all were talking about. I don't know how it works.
I think they stopped doing that. It used to be that whatever you did was recorded and whatever we did is irrelevant. But I think they changed that. So
right. I just didn't know if it. I don't know. We'll find out. Sorry, everyone. It's never happened before, but it's always got to happen once, right? Ryan, do you want to talk about ring composition, or did you already do that?
I didn't. When you want to bring up, do you want me to bring up? I'll bring up the slide.
I can put it on my screen.
Yeah, sure.
Although I fear that's may have been what.
Oh, okay, that's a good point.
But I'll put it on my screen so you can talk.
Yeah, with Grandpa Herodotus, I think it's very interesting to talk about digressions, and I think in book 4 we have a nice digression. Or two digressions. I tried to I think it's really, really helpful with Herodotus to have an overarching outline in front of you, especially when you're going to discuss a book, because I think you can see, I think he says things, he communicates things by the way that things, his digressions, and then when he comes back to them, what's important to him and how things sort of develop. This is a little bit difficult, I think, to actually outline easily or well, but what I've tried to do is talk about how in the first part, the opening logos, as we call it, I think, the 10th logos of Herodotus, he's talking about the Scythian way of life and evolution, and the way that they sort of develop as a nation and as an origin of tribes. He has this little interesting thing about strange myths that I think come out in 7. But then he has a digression of Heracles and how Heracles matters, which he comes back to. If you look at 1b way down on the bottom there, in front, right above the return to Darius, he comes back to Heracles's footprint, which is in the river there. That's a nice little, I think, set of bookends, perhaps. But he goes into the territory. He goes into the Aristeas, the poet. Then he starts talking about lands north and around and surrounding. But then he has this 3, I think, is really important. This map and relative size of the continents, and it looks like he's really, if you look at it this way, the one way to think about it perhaps is that he's talking about the Scythian territory. He has a digression on the poet, but then the lands north of Scythia, and then their lands, and then he's kind of doing a ring composition geographically. He's moving outward, if you look at it that way. He's Scythia, their national origin, their tribes, and then their territory, lands north of them, and then the continents. He's moving out again. It's almost as though it's his own type of ring composition. Does that make any sense? Then there's the circumnavigation, which I think is another digression from the continents. Then he comes back to some people might say is an endless discussion of rivers, which is perfectly fine. But I think that Herodotus identifies things by rivers. He says that they're west of rivers and east of rivers and north of rivers, and rivers matter to him, and it's a way that you can ground yourself really specifically and carefully. So maybe that's why he's coming back to that. He's moving all the way out, circumnavigation, and then he's coming into great, great detail. Then he comes back to God, sacrifices, cooking, sacrifices again, honor, divination, pledges, burials, and of course the ever-present and ever-important hemp use and consumption. So and then he has a couple of, I think, digressions on people. The arrowheads seem to be a very important thing for him. And then he comes back to rivers and Heracles' footprint, which I think is maybe a move back to the Heracles digression previously. Then he reminds us that Darius is really important and whether or not he should attack. And then again, dimensions and connections between major bodies of water, right? I think that again, he's very interested in grounding us and locating us again and again. And at the very end of this book, I'm interested in ends. And here, we end with, in some ways, the Hellespont and the Bosphorus and the Pontus. So I've just tried to, I think, talk a little bit about how he moves. One way to think about Herodotus is tracking his digressions, and I think 4 is an interesting example of that. The digression of the continents and the circumnavigation. I don't think it's out of place when he moves back to the rivers, because I think that's how he locates us. So that's I've just tried to offer a way to think about the way to look at book 4. I think these kinds of outlines, I think Herodotus, when we read Herodotus, he can overwhelm us with details and lists and facts, and these kinds of outlines might be a way to ground him a little bit, to help us help him communicate to us as we move toward book 5 and the ever-present and ever-important book 6. So that's what I wanted to offer, the sort of ground the digression of the continents and the circumnavigation, but then, what does he come back to? And that shows a certain importance in his life. So I know that we're out of time, but anyway, that was the idea.
Thank you. No, that's very helpful, and I think it's exactly right that it can help ground the material. And there are outlines online. Don't hesitate to use those if you are drowning in details as you're trying to read. Professor Fowler showed us a way to see how when you line these things up in an outline form, you can start to see those connections and how they build around each other. And that can make a very interesting understanding of what he's doing compositionally and how he's narrating the story. But it also can just help you follow some of the details if you're drowning a bit. So
it's good to track whenever you can.
Yeah. I don't know. I apologize. I've been sick this week, and I felt it was hard for me to read book 4 and concentrate in that state. But so I understand. All right. So keep talking about book 4 and what you find interesting in it. And we should get really excited for our big battles are coming up in book 5. But let's not.
Can I come back for book 5?
What's that?
Can I come back for book 5? Book 5 is so great. I like book 4 because it's sort of the calm before the storm.
Exactly.
The geography before the storm. But I'd like to come back.
Absolutely. You're always welcome. So, but we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. Let's continue to talk about book 4. And I know that some of you are having Slack meetings with your teams so that you're all, or most of you are online at the same time. And some of you are going to do that right now. So please do that. It's a good way to sort of study together if you're online at the same time and you can chat. All right. So we'll hear some of the student thoughts when we come back on Tuesday. And all right. Have a great evening. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for letting me sit in for a couple of minutes. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.